Thank you for coming to this panel. I think there's been a lot going on in the world of multifamily in the last several years, especially. And so I hope this is going to be a fruitful discussion. I'm Megan Booth. I'm the Associate Vice President for Commercial and Multifamily Real Estate at the Mortgage Bankers Association. I'm going to briefly introduce our panel, who I think most of you probably know. Sharon Wilson-Gino is the president of NMHC. She's a 30-year veteran of the housing industry and has helped guide numerous nonprofits and government entities around housing affordability, community development, and other housing policy challenges. She previously served as executive president and chief operating officer for Volunteers of America National Services, the housing and healthcare affiliate of Volunteers of America. Next to Sharon is Andrea Poser. She's the president and CEO of Stewards of Affordable Housing for the Future. She works to identify and develop and advocate for key strategic issues of concern to SAHF and its members, to create a level playing field for effective, mission-oriented nonprofit business, and to amplify SAHF's impact to create more sustainable properties and communities and improve the lives of residents. Prior to her work at Stewards, she served as federal policy director for LISC. Ken Bacon is the co-founder and managing partner of Realfield Realty Partners, an entrepreneurially run financial advisory and asset management firm focused on the multifamily sector, started in 2013. Prior to forming Realfield, he spent 19 years at Fannie Mae as the executive vice president of multifamily mortgage business. Shekhar Narasimhan, is the managing partner at Beacon Advisors, which provides strategic advisory services to companies and investors involved in real estate, mortgage finance, affordable housing, and related sectors. Shekhar is co-founder of the Reemergent Communities Fund and Opportunity Zone Fund, focusing on small towns and cities in the Southeast U.S. Prior to Beacon Advisors, he was managing director of Prudential Mortgage Capital Company. And we're going to have a good discussion. All right, I'm going to start with, so during COVID, a lot of priority was placed on housing as something that's critical to keeping people safe and healthy. And there are a couple different things that came out of that. One of them was eviction prevention and diversion efforts. And so they were really ramped up during COVID, and they sort of started to ramp down, but in some places are still moving on. So I think this led to a lot more discussions of rent control and rent pricing controls around the country. So Sharon, sort of where are we now, and what sort of alternatives are there to rent control?
Great question, thank you. Unfortunately, the idea of rent control has gained additional political speed coming out of COVID, largely because people are hurting. And I think every property owner and operator understands that, communities understand that. And it appears on the surface, and particularly to politicians that haven't spent a lot of time in the housing space, that that's an easy button solution. A constituent has this problem, I can fix it through rent control and move on. Unfortunately, the data has shown us, not just recent data, but data over decades, data in the United States, data in countries around the world, that rent control actually hurts renters. And that's the conversation we need to start having with people, and explaining that what we really need to create more affordability is housing supply, and how rent control efforts really hurt that supply chain for options in communities today that are hurting, but also thinking in the future and in communities of tomorrow. Our population in this country is going to continue to grow at a fairly incremental rate over the coming decades. We need to be planning for putting housing in communities and creating enough options for people so they can have those choices today, but also tomorrow as well. It's a long-term project. There is no easy solution to the current concerns a lot of people have, although there's a lot of things that can be done around increasing housing subsidy, emergency assistance, rental counseling, and eviction prevention, all things that our organization supports. But to engage in this conversation around rent control really is going to hurt us moving forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Sharon started talking about this, Shekhar, but one of the things that sort of came out of COVID was also some more help for residents when they're going through a hard time. So landlord-tenant mediation programs, right to counsel for tenants in an eviction. Do you want to talk a little bit about how this is working in the marketplace today, what we're seeing in different communities.
Sure, and thank you all for being here. This is about as important and as passionate a subject as you can get, particularly at a time like this when essentially all the different lifelines that were extended during COVID are over. ERA, the emergency rental assistance, the eviction moratorium. So whatever your views on any of that, during that 2-year period of COVID, I happened to end up as chair of the Virginia Housing Finance Agency, which is really the primary agency in Virginia on housing issues broadly, beyond just finance. And what was the most fascinating thing was that first and foremost, we could not, in the state of Virginia, identify how many renters we had, gross, how many were living in affordable. We knew what we had financed, but we did not actually know how to contact renters. So when you have a crisis, it's been said very often, there's an opportunity, we actually solved a lot of those data problems. But while we were solving it, we realized that the underlying issue was how did we talk to renters during the middle of a crisis, contactless, with a trusted intermediary, and actually start talking to them about what assistance was available, what other problems they were having, and so on. And frankly, just like in 2007, 8, and 9, that really the home ownership counseling industry got born. By the way, the Congress appropriated $850 million for home ownership counseling in the next 10 years. The rental housing counseling industry, I'm hoping, has been born because of the rentership crisis we had. And what it did was it taught us like 3 or 4 main things. One, the eviction moratorium, again, I don't know what everyone's views are, but had its downside. We have seen that in economic vacancy and affordable creeping up and increasing, depending on the jurisdiction to some extent, because it's about eviction laws. We did not see an eviction tsunami, but I attribute that very largely to both the fact that we had the emergency rental assistance program and that landlords actually stepped up and behaved largely pretty well, of course, never universal, and not only helped tenants get access to those programs, but actually encouraged them with their own programs not to be afraid to answer the door, to answer the phone call. So what did rental counseling teach us in Virginia, which went completely online? We served 30,000 tenants in the first 3 months through social service nonprofit intermediaries that they trusted. We paid $2 to every HUD counseling agency that was already doing home ownership for every dollar they spent on rental counseling. So it actually created a whole class of people who started to get trained. What we learned was rental counseling is way more complicated than simply helping a homeowner figuring out, a potential homeowner, how do you repair credit and get a down payment assistance. We found that tenants need to talk about food, access to other services, simply financial stability, issues in the household, mental health. So rental counseling is way more complicated, harder to do, more expensive, but almost essential in my view now. And so what I'd love to see us do is really spend a little bit of energy and time over the next 12 months figuring out how do we induce that to become something like a best practice for landlords to offer to tenants. That in fact, and now, by the way, we have technology. So you have tools like Isuzu, which enable you to, if the landlord agrees, to find the tenant, to not just do credit scoring and credit repair, but also offer rental loans at 0% interest rate that allows people to repair and to pay on time. You have programs like Build, PayScore, Slate. Go find the ways that you can now access tenants in a responsible way, communicate with them, reward them for good payment, but don't forget that there are downsides to just government intervention while you're doing this, whether it is rent control, or it is eviction moratoriums. There's a lot of moral hazard involved in doing these things that have after effects. So let's solve it with positive means and get the private sector involved in doing it.
Yeah, when you think about it, it's kind of crazy that we have all these homeownership counseling programs, which are generally for people who are in pretty decent financial shape if they're at the point where they're going to be buying a home. And then the people who actually probably need it more, who are renting or who are lower income, don't have that service of a counseling program. So maybe that is a good thing to come out of this if we can start that. So one of the other things that sort of crept up in lots of states now is the idea of just cause evictions. So do you want to talk a little bit about that? I don't know who wants to jump in on this one, but that sort of seems like a trend that's happening is this whole discussion around just cause evictions.
I'm happy to take a swing at it. I think it depends on how you define what is just cause. And that has been different in different states heretofore, or states that have experimented with those kinds of provisions. I think the important part that we're facing now, and this is also something else that has come out of COVID, it's not just the system for governing landlord-tenant relationships, which is done largely at the state and local level, and it really should be, but it's the enforcement mechanism that happens at the local courts. We can play around with that relationship and the laws that govern it in different places. However, if the courts aren't enforcing it, which is really what's happening in a lot of jurisdictions, including right here in the District of Columbia, we're really going to struggle with how to make it through and ensure we have the financial resources to maintain this really important housing stock, not just for the renters of today, but for the renters of the future, and to be fair to the other renters who are doing what they are thinking through, which is, okay, how do I access different types of programs? How do I get that assistance? So I think it's a really tough issue because it means different things to different people.
Yeah, absolutely. So it seems like the biggest solution to all of this is expanding the housing supply. If there's a lot more housing out there, there wouldn't be as many of these issues around price controls and things around rent. If you have more housing, there's going to be enough to meet the demand, and that will bring down prices, and it will, and provide more opportunities for people. So Ken, what does this mean for expanding the supply? How do we, with all these things going on, how do we induce developers to make more housing?
Well, I'm going to start with a favorite saying of mine: everybody wants to go to heaven, nobody wants to die. And that is, everybody says they want affordable housing, but at the end of the day, they say that, but they don't really want it. Not on my block, not my section of town, not my district. And capital markets are very efficient. And if you look at a program like the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program, which I don't think gets enough credit. I mean, it's probably been one of the best social programs this country's ever had, because you do the credits, you tell people, here are the rules, they build, they run the properties, and if you think about it, it's been relatively scandal-free given the size of the programs. But the reason it works is because when I get the credits, I know the rules. Here's what my rents are going to be. Here's what I have to do for the tenants. Everybody knows. So I think that one of the things that's happened is, if you tell me there might be rent control and that I'm going to make it difficult to evict people, all of a sudden I've injected what I call uncertainties into the system. I really don't know, right? I don't know what you're going to allow me to charge rents a few years from now. So you were right, it doesn't work well, and then you put on the eviction thing. So I think the best thing people can do, and again, some people have done it, is if you tell a developer, I want this to be affordable, here's what I'm going to do for taxes, and here's the process, a speedy process. For those of you who live in the district, you know how long it takes to get a deal done. And it's, I was driving up North Capitol one time and I passed by the reservoir behind Howard. And then I turned and I passed the old soldiers' home. And all I could think about is people have been talking about developing these areas for decades. So to the degree that people can just say, here are the things that have worked in terms of taxes, but most important of all, that here is a speedy process so you can get shovels in the ground. That the city says, before you even get here, we're going to give you a green light to do this project. And the problem is, again, I understand how local communities want to have a voice, but if you allow everybody to have a voice and weigh it all equally, then nothing gets done. Nothing gets done.
Yeah, I love that approach of the sort of the bottom line is just provide people with some level of certainty.
Yeah.
And then they can move forward.
Yeah, I
But when
mean-
when it's so many uncertainties about every part of the process, the construction process, and then even just the operating process throughout, it makes me wonder like why y'all do it.
And like I said, you look at the tax credit program, when people say, oh, you know, the economics don't work, I said, we have a program that works. The problem is it only goes up to 60%.
Right.
And that leaves out to school teachers, to policemen, what I call really working people, kind of get the shaft.
Yep.
And so we just need programs like that that attract capital. You tell people what the rules are, and people will figure out a way to play.
And just on that front, if I might add, the workforce housing tax credit bill was just introduced.
Yep.
Something that our organization and others have long worked on. So really bringing that tax credit success up to 100% of area median income is an exciting opportunity. Those people in that mix are often the people that are, when they're just over those income lines, they're the most vulnerable, and they've actually made progress from an income and economic standpoint. So being able to capture those is really exciting.
Yeah, absolutely. So Andrea, tell us about, I imagine nonprofits have even more sort of challenges and opportunities in this space. And so how do you all go about trying to expand access to affordable housing?
Yeah, happy to. So I mean, I think at the core, nonprofits are experiencing the same thing that everyone else is, right? All of the same operational challenges, an inflationary environment, and tremendous uncertainty. In most cases, the nonprofit multifamily housing providers I work with are trying to provide deeper affordability and address inequities beyond just access to affordable housing. And so that layers on additional complexity. A year or so ago, we were happy to be early adopters and joiners on the White House's Resident-Centered Management Challenge. We spent a lot of time through COVID thinking about how to address some of the challenges that Shekhar talked about, and really saw a need to keep that conversation going, as you're talking about, and saying, you know, how can we adopt some of these practices? How can we go and continue to be resident-centered? And what we've seen is a lot of what's already been discussed, that there are very different experiences around the country in different markets in the degree to which we are back to normal or still seeing tremendous economic pressures on renters and therefore on operators. And so what we see, we've collected data on about 100,000 households of groups participating in this cohort, and what we see is in markets like DC and to some extent Boston and Chicago, you still have really, really large rental arrears that are putting a lot of pressure on operators and obviously stress for residents. We also see that you continue to see racial inequities in who are having those challenges. I know overwhelmingly households led by Black women, and particularly Black women with children, are experiencing these challenges. But we also know they show up where there's rent burden, right? Even in a low-income housing tax credit program, which is incredibly efficient and does what it's supposed to do really well, we see people rent burdened and then, you know, racking up arrearages and problems that they're struggling to solve. I think we've got to recognize that we absolutely need to expand the tax credit program, and we need to allow it to do what it was built to do, and we need to resource ourselves well to go deeper in affordability. We need to provide more rental assistance, we need to provide more emergency safety nets, and we need to think up the income spectrum. It is not a silver bullet. It is a wildly successful program upon which we can model other solutions. The other thing we know is that in an affordable setting, resident services coordination has been really effective in connecting people to the things that they need. Not just the rental assistance, but the mental health, the access to food, the child care, the internet, all of those things. And certainly that makes more sense in a deeply affordable context to have that on-staff person, but there is no way to pay for this. This is coming out of cash flow. And when people can't pay their rent and your insurance is going up and your taxes are going up and your cost of staffing is going up, that cash flow is less available to pay for those things. So we're seeing all of these same pressures kind of come to bear. And as we think about expanding affordability, we've got to be thinking about preserving across the board, preserving the households, allowing people to stay in their home, preserving the buildings, the actual homes, and preserving the organizations that are here to do this work. Tom spoke well to what the downstream effects could be here if we don't get some relief on some of these pressures. Eventually, people will have to opt out of providing these services that really support stability or of affordability in general.
Yeah, so you touched on this. One of the things that was, I think, made the housing solutions during the pandemic work was the vast amount of housing assistance available to people, right? And I think that demonstrated how great the need is. The reason why, as Shaker said, we didn't have that tsunami of evictions was because people had adequate rental assistance to keep them going through that process. Given that it seems like Congress is unwilling/unable to just provide a chunk of new money for vouchers, despite all of us advocating for such, and everyone in this room, I'm sure, how do we sort of keep that drumbeat going, or what are the solutions we can have to doing just that? I think a lot of our problems with housing affordability would be solved if people were getting adequate housing assistance who need it. And how do we get there? Anyone?
Well, yeah, Megan, we live in the housing arena always as though the pie is extremely limited, and we have to cut it up in little tiny slices, and every one of us is competing with the other one. And as long as we do that, we will never come up with solutions that actually solve the problem.
Right.
Okay? I mean, Ken pointed out a critical problem, which is mostly at the local level. But the federal government can do a great deal to induce good behavior. We do this all the time, by the way. We said we're not going to pay any money for highways unless you have 55 mile an hour and you do seat belts, and people did that.
Exactly.
It's sort of almost irrational that we have never, except very recently, started to say, if you want transportation money, you have to do the following things. And it's not just about equity, it's about making sure there's housing, making sure there's affordable housing, make sure that the zoning, permitting, processing, et cetera, is expedited. So first, we need to get out of this notion of there's only so many dollars. We can't have a middle-income housing tax credit program at the same time as a low-income housing tax credit, because then we are literally not solving the problem. But the second to me, which I think is critical, is we absolutely cannot accept that this is not the #1 problem in the country. And we've got to start talking like that, because there isn't a single city I go, a single mayor I meet, a single county commissioner who, within the first 15 minutes, knowing a little bit about my background, doesn't start talking about, you know what, we have a serious housing problem. And it's in Maine, it's in Rhode Island, it's in Mississippi, it's in places everywhere. Okay, so if that's true, why is it that Congress doesn't see that same sense of urgency? Is it purely ideological? Actually, housing was one of the, and is still one of the few bipartisan domestic subjects that people agree on. It's because we haven't linked it appropriately to all the other things that they care about as well. So if you think about the left and right in our country, the one thing that people seem to agree upon, and I found this, by the way, just simply by asking 100 questions of people, that interestingly, Mitt Romney and Elizabeth Warren would agree on. And I can give you even more conservative members on the other side. Example, childcare. The fact that in America today, it costs on average for a child between 0 and 5, $18,000 per year to provide childcare. That's the number, by the way. That's like a college education in many places. You have 2 children, you can't work. So what have we done in just creating affordable housing if we could link it to the adequacy and provision of childcare, the ability for women, particularly people of color, who have children to be able to work, the self-sufficiency that comes with that. We have to find a way to take our issue, stop thinking of it as just a small pie, think about the residents and what they need, and link it to the other things that people care about. That's how you get 300 members of Congress to vote for you. We've got to figure out how to do that.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The thing about vouchers that, good job, Shakir. One thing that always confuses me about vouchers is if you look at the voucher program next to the food subsidy programs, right? During the pandemic, the federal government wasn't saying to Giant and Safeway, you need to lower your prices so people can buy food, right? And why is that? Because the SNAP program is actually, not that it doesn't have its issues, but it's actually pretty effective, right? People are able to go into their grocery store and get their basic needs, their milk, their eggs, their bread at Safeway without any complication. I'm a lot older than most of you. I grew up when people literally had little booklets of stamps and it was like a big to-do. Now it's like basically a credit card, right? Why are vouchers not a credit card? Even with the vouchers we have now, the challenges of getting property owners to want to take those vouchers because of the complications attached to the voucher program, that's just with the existing vouchers we have, never mind the greater issue around that. It makes me crazy how somehow USDA and have figured out how to deal with the food issue through farm subsidies, but then also the SNAP program and make it work for everybody. Again, not that it doesn't have problems, but in general, it works so much nicer than the housing voucher program. And aren't food and housing sort of the two basic things that everyone needs? And somehow we're way more successful on one side than the other. And then when you add on the fact of all the other parts that come along with the cost of housing in terms of having to pay for childcare and having a lower wage job that then it doesn't, $36,000 to put 2 kids in childcare, if you're only taking home $25,000 or even $30,000 with taxes and everything, you can't pay for that. And so then you don't have a job, and then you're not paying into Social Security, and then it just builds and builds and builds, right, and creates all this instability. And so I think that's a great strategy to try and think about it in conjunction with other things to show the overall impact of it.
And actually, there are a couple interesting experiments going on. I know you've been involved in some of them in communities across the country to create, and currently they're all foundation funded, but to create that debit card type approach for housing subsidy, both that it's directed to housing, but there are also experiments, and to your point, Shekhar, on just guaranteed minimum income. And then this is a conversation that's been had across the country. It's controversial. I have to say, in reading the data, I'm starting to move in a direction where I see it. And giving people that income support on an ongoing basis in an easy way to approach it seems to be an effective strategy. But that's a wage problem. I mean, wages at the lowest ends of the income scale have not kept up. We all say, oh, yeah, everyone's getting a salary increase, everything's great. That's not happening evenly, and the data will show you that. So the idea of even just a modest income support that could be tied to housing or could be tied generally to all those other expenses you're talking about, the things you're seeing in rental housing counseling as terms of people's needs, could make a huge difference. But I keep coming back to the same issue, though. The voucher type programs and rental subsidy programs are only as good as the housing supply we have available for people at that level. So we can talk about putting more money into Section 8, which we all support, and putting more money into emergency rental assistance, which we all support. If we do not have the supply, people are cannibalizing each other. And that's not fair. It creates enormous stress, particularly in low-income families. So we have to keep our eye on the prize, which is more supply, more supply. It's a long-term project. We can't just say, okay, give us some more vouchers and everything will be fine. That's not going to be a long-term strategy.
Yeah, let me comment on the income thing. For those of you who live in D.C., I'm the chair of Martha's Table. And Martha's Table and several nonprofits during COVID did pilot programs and supplemental cash income. And the results were great. Go to the Urban Institute. There are papers on this that will show the results. And what it highlighted for me is there's something that we don't talk enough about, and that is the cost of delivering services. So if you go to any county government, city government, there'll be a Department of Social Welfare. I've been in all these departments where you have employees, they get salaries, they have procedures, and you start adding it up. And a lot of times you'll see that a person at the lower end of the income spectrum, I need food, that's a program with I have to qualify for. I need rental assistance, I need health care. And the qualifications of all these things are different. What we discovered during COVID, you had to get people, you talked about a rental counseling. We had to almost give people what I call life counseling to navigate the bureaucracy. But when we gave people cash and said, here's some money, there's this assumption a lot of times that markets don't work, poor people are dumb. You educate people, and they made great choices. And so I think one thing this housing debate needs to take against what I call we stifled innovation, and we have created obstacles that make it hard to help people. And ask anybody who had to go through this stuff. And by the way, that $18,000 child care, please tell me where you found it.
I was thinking the same thing.
That's the national average.
Man,
So-
that must be deep in Arkansas somewhere, because it ain't here. But the same thing even goes to the supply. You know, if you go look, if I wanted to build affordable housing, ask any developer all the people they have to talk to get a deal done. Even when the city says, I want to cooperate, I want to make it easy, I got to go to a lot of different places. So I think that the one thing that the industry needs to do is to start going to politicians and saying, you know, we need to reinvent government. Now, that's at the federal level, that ain't gonna happen. But at the local level, just to tell people, if you looked at the cost of how much money you're spending to do this, and if you just combine this stuff, and like you said, if I gave somebody a card and said, look, this is your rent, food, you know, for the landlord's perspective, it's easy. Because, you know, I don't have to do any paperwork.
Right.
Here's the card. And by the way, I built this project. You said my property taxes weren't going to increase as long as I kept 30% of the units affordable at 100% of area median income. I can work with that.
Yeah, it goes back to that certainty,
Yeah.
right?
So if I keep harping the same thing,
No.
it's just because I can't overemphasize what I call the simplicity for the tenant, simplicity for the landlord.
So sort of going off what you said with Martha's Table, and that's, I'm going to go read those urban studies because that's fantastic. It seems like local governments and nonprofits are sort of, and I agree with the bureaucracy part of it, but are having some of the more innovative ideas to try and solve some of these issues locally across the country. How do we harness that and try and turn that into things that work at a larger level? How do we use those successes that have happened and try and catapult them onto a bigger stage? It seems like that's like the hardest challenge.
You know, I'm sitting here courtesy of David Dworkin, and so David's going to smile when I say this. Years ago at Fannie Mae, the city of Detroit had all these vacant houses. And I remember going with David to talk to the city and saying, you know, here's what New York City did. They were unaware and didn't want to do it because they had all these houses they had foreclosed on for property taxes. And anybody who bought the house would have to pay back the back taxes. And I said, that's crazy. I said, you know, the best thing you can do is give it away. And so what I've discovered a lot of times when I used to talk to people, they weren't aware of successes. And even when you told them about it, they didn't know how it worked. They were scared. And we live in, unfortunately, a climate today is we're in a very negative climate. Yeah. No one wants to, you know, if you have good news, it's almost like people don't want to hear it. And by the way, that's not just the right, it's also on the left. So you might have something on the right that says, oh, government is the problem. But on the left, all business is bad. And the thing is, there are things like, I used to hold up New York. New York City is not perfect, but if you look at the problems New York had in the 70s and the things they did to fix it, or when HUD did, unfortunately didn't last as long, when you look at what Renee Glover did with public housing in Atlanta. There have been successes, but the problem is that a lot of times those lessons learned are communicated, and even when people hear about it, oh, I heard about it, but no one says, here's the laws they had to pass, here's how it worked.
I mean, I think that's right, and I think it's good that we're all here for that reason. I think we have to support the places that we come together and lift up the successes. I was late getting here this morning because I was talking with a practitioner who's in the Midwest who said, you know, there's a lot of creativity happening in the state where I am and a lot of will to solve the problems we're facing, but they feel like the state and localities feel like we're going as far as we can. We need the federal government to do something. And while it's really hard to get anything done, I think things like, you know, expanding the tax credit, in providing some sort of flexibility or a relief valve somewhere for those state and local governments is a big part of scaling that innovation, because they need to feel like they can just take a breath and have a little bit of wiggle room in order to be creative.
Yeah. And even the experience I was talking about, I was recently at a convening that HUD was very active in, and they basically said, well, we want to lift these up. However, we have some legal and regulatory problems that prevent us from supporting them. And those are the kinds of things that as advocates, we need to lift up then to our federal lawmakers. It's not necessarily incumbent on the department to get those things fixed so we can pave the way for those as well.
Yeah, it's almost like we need to get like the mayors and the governors and the Congress in the same room and go like, look, here's some great example. That's like, this worked, let's do it. That'll never happen, but it would be nice. So Shekhar, you started talking a little bit about this, about the interplay with other agencies other than just HUD and USDA and VA, but mostly HUD on the housing front. And so, for example, I know, DOT just came out with all the big announcement about these transit-oriented grants where you can get grants to build affordable housing near transit. I will tell you that a bunch of my members listened in on those DOT webinars they did for developers about how to do it. And then they came back to me with a bunch of questions. And so I reached out to DOT and I said, great, who are you working with at HUD? And they were like, HUD? This is our program. Why are we talking to HUD? Because they provide the financing for the housing that you're going to build near transit. But they literally weren't talking to each other. And we see this across the federal government. Like, honestly, we see it, not to bash on HUD. I've seen it, the Office of Multifamily HUD and the Office of Public Housing at HUD don't talk to each other, right? So it's such a challenge. And so how do we try and link because I think you're right, it's all of it. It's healthcare, it's transit, it's housing, it's all together. What are ideas on how to link those things together? How do we get them to play nice in the same space?
So let me touch a little bit on the first thing that you pointed out, which is there's lots of different resources available today that were not available 2 years ago.
Right.
So first and foremost, if we keep thinking of the shrinking pie analogy again, the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund. I mean, Sadie's here with CPC, and maybe somebody's here from Enterprise. And look, it's $15 billion that's going to get allocated over 7 years. And a lot of it is tied to what do we do in the electrification of affordable housing. I mean, it's down to, if you wanted to make this very scientific, it's how do I save every household living there, in addition to doing good things for the climate and carbon emissions and all of that, how do I save them $50 a month or $100 a month in utility bills? And how do I make the planet greener at the same time? Sort of sounds like a no-brainer. It's hard to do. Just try convincing a mortgage banker, Megan, that in addition to doing their wonderful financing with the GSEs, that they should be doing greenhouse reduction financing, right. That they need to learn how the credits work. Because if you learned the low-income housing tax credit game, you can figure this one out. It's just really different because these are 7-year deals and they are blank, blank, blank. But there's a lot of money now that's going to be available for the next few years that's tied to the electrification of residential housing, particularly affordable. And it's not just about EV charging. This is about how do you reduce the bill for utilities. Right. And how do you put more money in the pockets of the residents? Not just for rent increases, but so that they can spend money and keep our economy growing, okay? So one, I would advocate strongly that when we think of solutions, we say, what are those things? Just as another example, the housing industry, I was told at one point, that if we innovated at the same rate as the iPhone would have taken 4,000 years. Okay? So there's a little bit of a problem here in terms of how stuck in the mud we are. Or in my case, it's stuck in the concrete. Let me give you an example. Concrete produces 25% of all the carbon emissions associated with the building of a house. It's the single largest contributor outside of other materials. There are fantastic and incredible substitutes for concrete today. But why don't people use it? Any? It's called the concrete industry? Okay, that's one. Okay, you speculate on the reasoning behind it. It could be some things in Congress. It could be some legislation. It could be some laws. It could be something called the building codes that's revised every year, but retroactively every 15 years. So it could be a lot of reasons that are stuck in the mud again. But there are alternatives to building materials, to construction techniques, to the way we do things that fundamentally need to change as well as everything Ken's talking about, certainty and so on. And I think we can start by saying to ourselves, if the pie could be larger, how could we distribute it so that it actually addresses the dimension of the problem we have, produces 4 million newer units to address our crisis, and actually provides more money in the pockets of residents? There's no one answer, but a multiplicity of answers is what we're going to have to find.
Yeah, I mean, I think things like the HUD Green MIP program is great, right? That helps people start sort of thinking in that idea when you're building. I think one of the bigger challenges is with existing buildings. It's a lot harder to make those buildings, more green or more sustainable than it is to build it in new construction. And even then, I feel like, much like the iPhone, as soon as you build it, it's out of date, right? Because it took you 5 years to build it with the plans and everything. And so I think that's definitely an ongoing challenge. And I do think you're right that there's a lot of innovation. If you look at other countries, how far behind we are with modular housing, manufactured housing, we're way below Europe in using those ideas, and it's largely due to regulatory barriers in the process of doing it. And so I think having to try
And the industry.
and getting everyone geared up for it, and sort of there's stigmas around manufactured housing, getting sort of past all of that. So there's a lot of factors there, but you sort of started touching on the sustainability. Sustainability seems to be sort of the biggest thing we're all talking about, right? That the government's talking about, and all these new things we have to do to try and make more resilient properties. Oftentimes, those can cost more upfront. They might save the resident money in the long term and save the building money in the long term. But upfront, there can be higher costs for that. So what are you all seeing? What are the challenges we're seeing in sort of the guidance around green, sustainability, all of that, and how is that impacting housing affordability or housing development now?
I mean, I think there's an opportunity for this to be a really good thing, but everybody's got to take a breath and be pretty thoughtful here, right? The need to become more sustainable, to decarbonize, to electrify, is coming, right? There are many jurisdictions that already have building performance standards, and many more where they're coming. If you look at the map of the mayors and the governors who have joined the White House's challenge, it's coming, and it's coming very quickly. So even if this doesn't feel important to you, it's going to be made important to you by those fines that are really sizable and come on pretty quickly over the next 5 years in a lot of these jurisdictions. And so I think thinking about where you can use these funds impactfully is really helpful, and it doesn't have to be the most innovative and shiny thing. I think we want to pilot those things. I think we talk about successes. We really should applaud HUD. They're doing a pretty good job with that little green and resilient retrofit program at how quickly and thoughtfully they've executed, both to sort of incentivize innovation, but also do some of the low-hanging fruit for people that don't have the capacity. But I think thinking about this as a way to address preservation too, of what do you do with some of these properties that really need work to become healthier and more sustainable. This could be a solution if at the local government level and the federal agency level we're thinking about how we layer this in. It cannot drive the whole transaction. It's got to fit in with the reality of capital markets and subsidy programs where you're talking about affordable. And we've got to build a workforce of people who are asset managers and developers who have the capacity to think about how to access these funds, because these folks are so overwhelmed. They don't have time to think about one more set of things right now. But also the people that can maintain and realize the promise of some of these technologies, because the last thing you want to do is spend time and money to do this and then not get the economic and health benefits of it on the back end.
And to Ken's earlier point, we have to continue to reduce barriers and evolve faster as we're seeing the green technologies evolve. 10, 15 years ago, all of that green money was tied to performance indicators, and we're all measuring all the success that we're having by the kilowatt or whatever. We know this technology works now. So, and to your point, I think HUD did a better job in this green retrofit program. Instead of making it complicated and creating this whole infrastructure around the tracking of this, let's just provide the resources to do it and make it simple.
Well, one thing that happened when I was at Fannie Mae, and it's expanded under Jeff Hayward and Michelle Evans, we started a green mortgage program. I see Ann McCulloch here who could get up. I've forgotten, I'm old, forgot all the details. But it was not radical. I mean, it wasn't like asking for 50% reduction in emissions, anything. We basically said, if you do these things that reduces the tenant's utility bills by X%, we will give you a break on the mortgage. Sometimes I always say you can't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. So I think that when you can offer people, again, working with the market, a financial incentive to do things. So, you know, Fannie and Freddie said, we want to see more affordable. We're going to allocate a certain percentage of our loan dollars to things that serve these goals. Is it perfect? No. And I'm sure a lot of people would say they could do more, but the point is, it was a step in the right direction. And what it served to do is it got people thinking about things they didn't think about before. And so to the degree that you can get the people that provide the money, not anything crazy, but incremental steps, then not only makes a difference, but it also educates people. Because one of the problems, if you look at the, you know, Shaker mentioned iPhone, if you look in tech, you always have people causing disruptions, but you also have huge companies, I mean, the Microsoft, the Googles, you look at what's happening with artificial intelligence, they've got billions of dollars to spend. You get to real estate, I doubt there's no one in the country even has 5% of the multifamily housing. I don't think there's anybody who's even got 5%. There's not a, you know, we think of, oh,
Very
related is
fragmented.
big. It's very fragmented. So it's very hard to go to any one real estate company or to a developer and say, hey, I want you to sink a lot of money into research, development. I want you to be innovative. So how do you do that? You really got to go back to some of the sources of capital and say, we will put out the carrot, we will put out the rules to foster this innovation, because the industry, just the structure of the industry, and it's also hard because if we go look at what our universities do, I mean, I've been astounded, you know, when Shaker mentions the thing about concrete, every few years I read about somebody developing some new material that would, it's faster, cheaper, better insulation, but there's not the venture dollars out there to commercialize it. And I think it's kind of sad that you can get money. I mean, if I say I got a great video game, you know, that will destroy your kid's mind and have them sitting around eating popcorn and, you know, oh, I got money. There's even venture capital for the cannabis industry. I like to say cannabis. I can't believe I said weed. But anyway, I aged myself. But, you know, it's true. You go look at all the stuff we've got.
Absolutely.
Huge pools of capital for stuff that no social good. And yet no one's put up money for, like, how can we do this cheaper? I don't think you should put that on the builder. So I'd really like to see either some foundations or else, you know, a consortium of banks or somebody say, you know what, we're going to fund, here's $1 billion every year that we're going to fund for materials and innovation, and we're going to make that available, because it doesn't happen right now.
I mean, I think that's the promise of the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, though, right? And I think it's absolutely right to call for some private sector investment that, you know, could be further leveraged on top of that. But to Shekar's point of we're so used to operating in this scarcity mentality, I think we don't want to miss the moment to absolutely take those incremental steps forward, but also say we have a moment here where we can think about how to do this more equitably and how to actually move markets and do innovative things. So I think it's really important that we all flip the switch in our brains right now to stop being so scarce in how we think about this and be a little bit aspirational while still thinking about how do you just put one foot in front of another.
Okay, so we have 10 minutes left. I can take audience questions if people have questions. I see one right there in the center there.
Good morning, or almost good afternoon. Thanks for such a fabulous session. My name is Keely Hansen. I'm with JP Morgan Chase. I'm a very proud Californian. I most recently came to the firm having worked for the Department of Housing in California there under the Newsom administration. And one of the challenges, especially as a Californian, you know, anybody you talk to about California, they're like, it's so expensive, the housing crisis. Yes, yes, yes. And I worry, and sometimes in my previous role was worried, that the narrative becomes so bogged down by the issues and the problems that we never get to the solutions. And I found, even though we were investing record, like historic investment, rolling out innovative programs and actually getting to wins, that because it hadn't been fully felt yet, Californians weren't realizing that we were actually making improvements and advancements. So I'd love to hear from you all, like, what gives you hope? What's out there that you feel like, you know what, that might actually move the needle?
I think SB 35 in California gives me hope, where the state of California removed some really significant local barriers to getting any multifamily property with affordability in it move forward. It has been proven already with preliminary studies that it's working, including their very difficult environmental statute that was the thing that people were using to be the one person who was standing in the way of more multifamily development. So that's a small example, but I think that is a really great opportunity for us to continue to show that in other places.
So I'll give you two examples. One is crazy enough that hopefully you laugh. And the second is actually quite practical. 10 years ago, we started an experiment. It started primarily in Virginia and in Massachusetts on ADUs. And it really started with the concept of intergenerational housing, as opposed to just housing for rent that you could earn an income on and stay in your home. It is prevalent now across California. It could produce 1 million new housing units that actually are needed and can be built for 150 to 200,000 rather than, the flip side of it is that in California, I have actually seen an affordable housing project last week, actually this week, that cost $1 million a door. That's really bullshit. That's not affordable.
Yes.
How is that affordable housing? I mean, give me a break. Apologies for, but you can't argue and justify and sit in front of Congress and ask for subsidies for something that costs $1 million a year, a unit to build. We got to figure it out. So here's the wild idea. If in Dubai, they could figure out how to build islands off the coast, which create exit land, well, hell, do that outside San Francisco. You'll solve the housing problem.
Actually, I'll say that I think one of the best things to happen in California, as painful as it is what happened to downtown San Francisco. Because all of a sudden, my mother used to always say, a hard head leads to a sore behind. And you could not get the people in San Francisco to do anything for housing. And all of a sudden, oh my God, the tax base is fleeing. Oh my God, the companies are fleeing. And now the city is saying, oh, we're going to make it easier for you to convert these offices. That's not going to make a real dent in the problem, but the thing is, they got brought to their knees. And so sometimes you have to never waste a crisis. And so I just think that a lot of people in California, governments used to feel, I don't have to do it, even when the state did it. I think San Francisco's they're learning a lesson.
So I'll just add what gives me hope is that every week I get a new call from somebody with a new idea. And I've had to move my own mindset out of, oh, you don't understand how hard this is, to, wow, 15 years ago, nobody cared about housing affordability. It was hard to get anybody to talk to me, and now my phone is ringing off the hook with bright people thinking new ideas. And really move to action. I am a very proud Virginian by transplant. Last week in the city of Alexandria where I lived, our council passed something called zoning for housing that opened up the whole city to something more than single family zoning. It's a down payment on more work, I think, and we'll see how it goes. That couldn't have happened 5 years ago. So I think that's really hopeful.
I think we have one over here.
Thank you so much. Araceli Panameño with Compass Working Capital. Thank you for this session. We've been talking about the housing supply, and I am with you on that. The good Lord is not building any more dirt on this planet, so we have to figure it out. I want to bring into the conversation the side of the tenants. We at Compass Working Capital are a deliverer and service provider of financial coaching to people who are in the family self-sufficiency program. We believe it's a stellar program that needs to be expanded. What are your thoughts on expansion? How would you go about it? How can we make the family self-sufficiency program more widely known? I mean, it surprises me when I mention it to anyone, whether it is in DC or in the halls of Capitol Hill. They're like, the what? Don't even know it exists. Help me out. let's help out the people that are actually receiving federal rental assistance. Let's expand the program. It addresses a lot of the issues that you're talking about from the tenant side in terms of being a manager, right? You mentioned of meeting them where they're at and having to help them navigate. How would you go about expanding the program? Thank you.
I'll take a crack at it. I think it gets to the point of two things. One, we have a moment in time, right? And we're coming out of this idea that there was an eviction crisis, although arguable, but that the Family Self-Sufficiency Program is a federally funded eviction prevention program, effectively. And it has been that way for quite some time. It has had great success in the small pockets in which it's been implemented. It now has a tried and true thing. So a lot of that is, in my view, a resource issue. But I think the other thing that you mentioned is I like to think that housing providers, we are on the side of the tenants. We are on the side of the residents that we serve. Resident success is housing provider success. So making sure that the language that we use it shows that there isn't this dichotomy and politicians have to pick one thing or the other. It is all of us together solving this housing problem.
And look, it goes back to what I started with, rental counseling, bottom line. And by the way, the Urban Institute just did a report on this. So if you haven't looked into what does that mean, it's about giving a trusted intermediary the opportunity to talk to somebody who may or may not think they need them. But I'm not into, can I build a super app for tenants? I'm into how do human beings talk to other human beings and offer them advice, services, access to. This is one of those things that we learned. And we ought to take those 30,000 lessons and translate it to the halls of Congress, because these programs do work, but they've got to work in conjunction with the need and in conjunction with access.
Yeah, I think part of this is FSS is a fantastic and very successful program that for many years lived in public housing and didn't have as much of a constituency. On the multifamily side, you get to use it when you can figure out how to pay for it, when you can figure out how to pay for the wonderful coaching services of Compass or that service coordinator that helps make it happen on site. Until you find the way to pay for that human connection, it's going to be harder to build that constituency. So I think we all need to be out there asking for what is a very small investment that is leveraged in great returns for residents and for property outcomes.
All right, thank you. I think we one more question. All right.
Hi, my name's Mary Griffin. I'm with the Cooperative Development Foundation, and I just wanted to speak across many of the issues you're talking about. We've been working on promoting more shared equity housing, community land trusts, limited equity cooperatives, resident-owned communities for manufactured housing. And we convened about 40 people from around the country a couple weeks ago, multi-stakeholder, the municipalities. There's so many, to your point, there's so many interesting solutions going on. We're trying to figure out exactly what's needed, a tenant right to purchase laws, things like that that are needed, getting more leverage from the federal government. But one of the things that we hear again and again in the IRA money is we know there's money, we know there's a lot of things. As you know, the people on the ground are completely hamstrung by not being able to access these programs in easy ways. And we need to really push, I think, to make these programs more accessible and understandable. And there's a big focus for us in our world, New York included, about preserving the co-ops and some of these housing, because we're facing a huge crisis. IRA is perfect for it, to put money in there. So, but I do want to talk about the need for, which we hear again and again, that startup capital, and the need for lenders to, this choice between rental and single-family home ownership. It's just we can't keep using that. We have to think about these different solutions. Shared equity co-ops have been around for decades and decades, proven. You don't have to be new to be innovative. So I just would really like to hear more about, I know Fannie Mae has a shared equity program. We had them there. We had USDA there. There's a lot more interest in it, but about how we can kind of get more of the lending capital to sort of understand these models and provide it, because it's what communities want right now, and they're sort of begging for it. So I just wanted to point that out. Thank you very much.
I think my answer is it's all part of the solution. and it all needs to be in the mix, and people need to understand it. And there are financing barriers outside of some of the major cities because of lack of understanding and appreciation. But the bottom line is there's 100 good ideas. It's what can be scaled, what can actually begin to achieve the results that we're looking for, which is not just short-term building more housing, but long-term sustainability of that housing, and most importantly, the sustainability of the renter. And if we can just figure out how to center ourselves in what that accomplishes, the resources are out there, bottom line. We should stop thinking the resources are limited. We can advocate for more. We just got to figure out how to bundle it and deliver.
That's great. And I think it actually all boils down to Ken's point at the beginning about certainty. It's certainty for the developer, certainty for the renter, certainty for the communities. I think that's when we can come up with solutions that focus on that, I think that's where we're going to have more success. Okay, we're going to actually break for lunch, which will be right here in this room. But first, I want to thank this panel. I think it was a great discussion.
How long was your Sunday night?
It's a very nice
Thank you so much. That was great. That was a great panel. We're going to be opening the air walls for lunch. Help yourself. Bring it back to your place. Folks will be coming in from the other room. And because so many of us are here, if you're a Fannie Mae alumni, come on up. We'll take a family picture.